When empires fall, history books talk about kings. They talk about leaders. They talk about grand battles, shifting borders, and the ink drying on forgotten treaties. But think about it. What do those history books almost never talk about? The people who actually paid the price. The shopkeeper whose business vanished overnight. The farmer whose land was taken. The soldier who fought for years, only to come home to find nothing left. The family who followed all the rules, worked hard every day, did everything right, and still lost everything. When an empire reaches its final stage and begins to decline, the most important story isn't about what happens to the power brokers in their palaces. It's about what happens to ordinary people just trying to live their lives. Because empires don't collapse on maps first. They don't crumble in the halls of government first. No, they collapse in kitchens as families struggle to find their next meal. They collapse in marketplaces where the currency becomes worthless. They collapse in neighborhoods where trust between neighbors disappears and fear takes its place. This is the story history rarely tells. It's the one we're going to explore. Not just how empires fall, but what life truly becomes for the people left behind in the aftermath. What does it look like when the world you knew is gone? When the systems you relied on have failed? It's not just a story about the past. It's a story about resilience, about survival, and about what it means to rebuild from the ashes. We'll look at the patterns, the human experiences that echo through time, from ancient Rome to more recent history. We'll uncover the personal stories that are often buried beneath the headlines of political upheaval. How do people adapt? How do they find hope when everything seems lost? This isn't just a history lesson. It is a look into the heart of what it means to be human during times of immense change. The story of what happens after the fall is often more profound than the story of the fall itself. So stick around as we uncover the forgotten side of history.
Ever noticed how the strangest part of a great power's decline isn't some huge, dramatic event? At first, almost nothing looks different. The flag is still flying. The government still makes announcements. The laws are still on the books. People wake up, go to work, and carry on with their daily routines, just like they always have. Life feels normal. But underneath the surface, something fundamental has shifted. Slowly, quietly, the old rules stop working the way they used to. Think about the cities in the late Roman Empire. Citizens were still paying their taxes, but the roads they used every day stopped being repaired. They were crumbling. The markets in the town square still opened every morning, but the stalls were emptier. Essential goods became harder and harder to find. Soldiers still patrolled the city walls, but their protection became unreliable. You couldn't count on them like you used to. It's a slow erosion of the very systems that hold a society together. For ordinary people, for you and me, decline doesn't start with a bang of fear. It begins with a whisper of confusion. It's a feeling that things are just off. Prices in the store start to feel unpredictable, jumping up for no clear reason. The promises made by leaders and institutions start to feel weaker, hollow. Services that were once efficient now feel slower, bogged down. Getting a permit, seeing a doctor, even just getting a package delivered, takes longer than it should. And the most frustrating part, no one can seem to explain why. You ask questions, but the answers are vague. Experts on the news offer conflicting theories. Politicians blame each other. It creates this quiet, creeping anxiety. The systems you've relied on your whole life are still there, but they're not delivering. The world looks the same, but it doesn't feel the same. It's this gap between appearance and reality that marks the true beginning of the end. It's not a sudden collapse, but a slow, baffling decay of trust and function, happening right before your eyes. For most of us, money isn't about power, it's about safety. It's the buffer between you and a sudden car repair, a surprise medical bill, or just the peace of mind knowing you can cover next month's rent. But what happens when that buffer starts to dissolve? When an empire or a great power enters its final turbulent stage, money is often the first shield to crack for ordinary people. History shows us this pattern again and again. Let's look back at the final years of the Roman Empire. Imagine you're a Roman citizen. The coins in your pouch, the ones you've earned through hard labor, suddenly start losing their value. They're being debased, filled with less precious metal. This isn't just an abstract economic problem. It means the price of bread, oil, and wine starts climbing faster than your wages can keep up. Your life savings, carefully set aside over decades, begin to disappear silently. You wake up one day and realize a terrifying truth. The money that was supposed to protect you and your family no longer can. The foundation of your security has crumbled. Now, let's jump forward in time to post-imperial Britain. After the Second World War, the empire was fading and the economic fallout hit home. Rationing, which people endured during the war, actually lasted for years after the fighting stopped. Imagine saving up for a little luxury, only to find you still need a coupon for it. Middle-class families who had felt secure for generations suddenly found themselves slipping downward. The old expectations that a good job and a bit of saving would guarantee a comfortable life collapsed. The promise of stability that money once held was broken, leaving a sense of bewilderment and anxiety. Or consider the late Soviet Union. On paper, people had jobs and received salaries, but those rubles meant very little. The real currency wasn't cash, it was access. The store shelves were often empty. What mattered more than your bank account was who you knew. Connections could get you a pair of boots, some decent sausage, or medicine for a sick relative. Goods became the new wealth, and favors were the new currency. The official money system became almost a side note to the real economy of barter and influence. When people see their money losing its power to protect them, it fundamentally changes how they think. The old wisdom of saving for a rainy day starts to seem foolish. Why save something that will be worthless tomorrow? A new mindset takes over. Spend it quickly. Hoard physical goods that hold their value, like food, tools, or anything useful. Cultivate relationships and trade favors, because people become more reliable than currency. Money transforms from a symbol of trust and future security into a hot potato you want to get rid of as fast as possible. This isn't just ancient history. It's a recurring lesson about what we truly value when the systems we rely on begin to fail. Empires promise a simple, powerful deal. Work hard, follow the rules, and you will be safe. You will have stability. But when an empire enters its final stage, that promise breaks. And this isn't just a historical footnote. It's a profound shift in how everyday life works. In a declining empire, the jobs still exist, but the stability they once offered disappears completely. Promotions stop being a reliable path to progress. It's like climbing a ladder that's sinking into the ground. We see this pattern throughout history. In late Rome, soldiers, the very backbone of the empire, were paid late, if at all. Their loyalty wavered because the system could no longer keep its end of the bargain. In Britain, after its imperial peak, the idea of a lifelong career with one company, a pillar of middle-class life, simply vanished. In the Soviet Union, your qualifications and skills meant nothing if you didn't have the right political connections. Effort no longer guaranteed a good outcome. When people realize this painful truth, it changes their behavior on a fundamental level. They stop making plans for 10 or 20 years down the line. Why save for a future that feels so uncertain? Trust in big institutions, the government, the banks, the corporations of the focus shifts from long-term growth to short-term survival. It's a quiet, personal revolution happening in millions of households. But here's the interesting part. When large, centralized systems begin to fail, smaller, more local systems rise to take their place. As the empire recedes, community rushes in to fill the void. After the decline, ordinary people don't look to the distant capital for help. They rely on family, on their neighbors, on their local networks. In the final days of Rome, protection didn't come from the emperor. It came from local strongmen and landowners. In post-imperial Britain, community centers and local clubs helped replace the lost sense of a grand, imperial identity. And in the USSR, informal networks, the system of Blatt, was what actually fed entire cities when the state-run stores were empty. The state becomes an abstract, distant force, while your community becomes essential for your day-to-day existence. This isn't an open rebellion. It's not about marching on the capital with pitchforks. It's a much more subtle and powerful process. Adaptation. People don't overthrow dying empires. They simply outgrow them, building new, smaller worlds within the shell of the old one. You know, movies always get it wrong. When society starts to decline, they show everyone panicking, rioting in the streets. But that's not what really happens. Most people don't panic. They adjust. They adapt. Sure, fear is a sharp, intense feeling, but there's something far more dangerous. Resignation. It's a dull ache, a quiet acceptance. People just stop expecting things to get better. They stop demanding a better future for themselves and their children. You start to hear it everywhere, in quiet conversations and tired sighs. Well, this is just how things are now. That single sentence, that quiet surrender, has toppled more empires and ended more civilizations than any army or war in history. It's the moment we stop fighting for better that the real decline begins. What happens to money when an empire falls? Most people think it just disappears, that everything collapses into a world with no money. But history tells a much stranger, more complex story. Money doesn't vanish. The rules of money change. This is one of the most misunderstood moments in history. Think about the late Roman Empire. People were still using coins, day in and day out, but the trust in those coins was gone. The amount of silver in them kept dropping, gold became rare, and prices shot up unpredictably. While the government kept saying everything was fine and stable, the reality on the streets and in the markets was completely different. This huge gap between official stories and what people actually experience is the start of a currency reset. It's not a sudden crash, it's a long, slow, grinding transition. Look at Britain after its empire. The pound sterling didn't disappear, but it lost its throne as the world's main currency. Britain had to devalue its money, rely on other economic systems, and completely redefine its place in the global economy. The empire was gone, but the currency had to adapt to a new, humbler reality. It survived, but it was changed forever. Or take the Soviet Union. Technically, the ruble still existed, but it barely worked. It couldn't buy you what you needed. So what did people do? They went back to basics. They bartered goods, relied on personal connections, and made informal deals. The official money was there, but the real economy ran on a different set of rules. So, when an empire enters its final stage, currency doesn't just evaporate. It becomes more local, more practical, and its value becomes conditional. It depends on who you are, where you are, and what you have to trade. This period creates a lot of anxiety because it feels so unpredictable, so chaotic. But if you look at the pattern throughout history, it's not just random chaos, it's a waiting. Money stops being a tool for grand imperial projects and global ambitions. Instead, it returns to its most fundamental purpose, serving the immediate needs of survival. It's a painful adjustment, but it's a natural cycle. The rules of the game change, and those who understand that change are the ones who navigate it best. Hey everyone, let's talk about a common myth. The idea that when a society declines, it just explodes into total chaos and disorder. We picture riots in the streets, a complete breakdown of everything. But history tells a very different, and honestly, a more hopeful story. The truth is, after what seems like a final stage of decline, order doesn't just vanish, it shrinks. Think about the Roman Empire. When Rome fell, it wasn't an overnight apocalypse. Yes, the grand imperial cities declined, but life continued. Villages and local communities stabilized. People stopped looking to a distant emperor and started relying on local leaders. Unwritten customs and traditions took the place of complex imperial laws. It was a shift from large-scale, impersonal rule to small-scale, personal community. We saw a similar pattern with the British Empire. As its global reach contracted, guess what happened back home in Britain? Domestic order actually strengthened. They built new institutions, focused inward, and adapted. The empire got smaller, but the core became more stable for a time. And what about the Soviet Union? A more recent example. When the massive, centralized state fell apart, people didn't just give up. The national order was gone, but local networks, friends, family, neighborhood connections kicked in and ensured people could survive. These informal systems became the new safety net. So, what's the big takeaway here? After a major decline, society reorganizes. It becomes smaller, closer, and more personal. Trust shifts. People stop putting their faith in huge faceless systems like massive governments or global corporations. Instead, that trust is reinvested in what's tangible and close: their family, their local community, and the familiar systems they use every day. Large-scale trust weakens, but small-scale trust deepens. This is the secret to why great empires can decline for decades, even centuries, without completely disappearing in a flash. The system doesn't fail everywhere all at once. It fails selectively, piece by piece. The big, complex parts might crumble, but the small, local foundations hold firm. Now, this phase is definitely uncomfortable for the elites, for the people at the top. Their influence becomes much harder to project and control when power is decentralized. But for ordinary people, it often feels less like a catastrophe and more like an adaptation. It's about finding new ways to live and work together on a more human scale. History reminds us of a powerful lesson. People are far more resilient than empires. Systems can change, borders can shift, but the fundamental human drive to create community and order always finds a way. Have you ever wondered what happens after a major civilization falls? We often picture total chaos, with everyone suffering equally, but history tells a very different story. The truth is, after the final stage, suffering is not equal. This is a critical concept to understand. The people who suffer the most aren't always the poorest. Instead, they are the ones most dependent on the old system. Let's look at the fall of Rome. The urban populations who relied on the state for grain and stability were the first to suffer. Meanwhile, rural communities, already more self-sufficient, found it easier to adapt to the new reality. They could grow their own food and reorganize locally. Fast forward to the decline of the British Empire. It wasn't the average person in Britain who felt the immediate sting. It was the colonial elites, whose power and influence were tied directly to the empire's reach. Back home, domestic institutions simply reorganized and moved on. A more recent example is the collapse of the U.S., who struggled the most. The state-dependent workers, the ones whose jobs and security were guaranteed by the centralized government. When that guarantee vanished, they were left with nothing, but who adapted quickly. The informal traders, the hustlers, the people who were already operating on the fringes of the official system. They thrived in the new, decentralized economy. So, when a system collapses, who are the winners? It's the flexible people, the ones who can pivot and learn new ways of doing things. It's the skilled individuals, whose abilities are valuable no matter who is in charge. And it's those with strong personal and community networks, who can rely on each other instead of a distant government. And the losers, they are the ones who put all their faith in centralized guarantees. They are the people whose entire identity and livelihood are tied to the old imperial systems. When that system disappears, their world shatters. This is precisely why decline feels so deeply unfair. Because it is. History doesn't collapse evenly. It doesn't just end. It redistributes power evenly, quietly, and persistently. It's a slow, grinding process of some rising while others fall. Have you ever wondered what comes after a great empire falls? It's one of the biggest misunderstandings in history. We often look for a single, dramatic replacement, like a new king taking the throne. But history rarely works that way. It doesn't just crown a new empire overnight. Instead, what really happens is much quieter, much more subtle. Let's look at the fall of Rome. After the Western Roman Empire crumbled, there wasn't a new Rome that immediately took its place. Instead, the successor was an institution, the church. It stepped into the power vacuum, providing social structure, preserving knowledge, and stabilizing a fractured Europe. Alongside it, small regional powers slowly began to form and consolidate, building the foundations of future nations. It was a gradual, distributed process. Fast forward to the decline of the British Empire, who took over, we might say, the United States. But it wasn't a sudden hostile takeover. America's rise was first and foremost economic. The US dollar became the world's reserve currency, and American financial institutions gained immense influence. This new form of power wasn't about controlling territory with an army. It was about shaping the global economy. The successor wasn't another empire in the traditional sense. It was a new system of financial and cultural influence. Then came the collapse of the Soviet Union. Again, no single power absorbed its vast influence. What happened instead? Regional blocs, like the European Union, gained more importance. Economic power became more spread out, with new centers of growth emerging in Asia and elsewhere. Power became less about one superpower and more about a network of influential players. The world became multipolar. So what does this tell us about the future? As any current global power changes, its successor might not be what we expect. Power is likely to become even less visible, less centralized, and more distributed. It might be held by tech giants, international organizations, or networks of cities. This is why you often hear people say, there is no replacement when they look around today. They're looking for another empire, another nation-state to take the crown. But history teaches us a different lesson. The replacement doesn't announce itself with trumpets and parades. It grows silently in the background, building new systems and structures. Empires fall loudly, making headlines for years. but their successors rise quietly, often unnoticed until they've already reshaped the world. So, the next time you think about the rise and fall of nations, remember to look for the quiet ones. They're the ones who truly inherit the future. Have you ever wondered what happens after an empire falls? We often picture chaos, darkness, and a world thrown into reverse. But what if that's the wrong way to look at it? What if the end of one era is actually the beginning of something entirely new? Let's take a look at history, because it has a fascinating story to tell us. Think about the fall of Rome. It's often portrayed as the end of civilization, but was it? The collapse of the Western Roman Empire didn't erase history. It planted the seeds for medieval Europe. It led to the rise of new kingdoms, new languages, and new cultural identities that shape the continent to this day. It wasn't an ending. It was a massive, messy, and ultimately creative redefinition. Fast forward a few centuries. The British Empire, on which the sun famously never set, began its decline. Did the world stop turning? No. Its decline helped pave the way for the modern global system we live in now. It triggered independence movements across the globe, leading to the birth of dozens of new nations, each with its own voice and destiny. The world order didn't get worse. It got more complex, more diverse, and in many ways, more representative. And in our own lifetimes, we witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union. Many predicted global instability and conflict, and while the transition wasn't seamless, what emerged was a reshaped geopolitical landscape. New alliances were formed, old rivalries faded, and countries that had been behind the Iron Curtain were free to chart their own course. The world became different, not necessarily worse. Here's the crucial lesson history teaches us again and again. Recovery after a major power collapses is never immediate. It's not comfortable, and it's certainly not predictable. But it always happens. The world after empire isn't a void. It's a space for reinvention. New systems of governance form. New cultural values emerge. New balances of power appear. The real danger isn't the fall itself. The greatest danger lies in stubbornly clinging to the past, in refusing to adapt to a changing world. Empires seem to fall fastest and hardest when their leaders focus all their energy on preserving what they once had, instead of preparing for what comes next. History shows us that the future is not about preventing change, but about navigating it. It's about recognizing that the end of one chapter is simply the prologue to another, unwritten one. History has a funny way of judging empires. It doesn't punish them for becoming powerful. In fact, it rewards them for it, for a time. But then comes the test. The real test isn't about strength, or wealth, or territory. It's about whether they can change. We often talk about the final stage of an empire as if it's a death sentence, a guaranteed collapse into dust and forgotten stories. But that's not quite right. It's not a cliff edge. It's a crossroads. Look at Rome. It built roads, laws, and legions that shaped the world. But when faced with internal decay and external pressures, it couldn't reinvent itself fast enough. Its rigid structures became its shackles. The system that made it great was the very thing that prevented it from adapting, and it fractured. Now, consider the British Empire. It saw the writing on the wall, albeit slowly. As the tide of colonialism turned, it transitioned, sometimes gracefully, sometimes clumsily, into the Commonwealth. The power dynamic shifted, but the network, the influence, in a new form, survived. It adapted. Then there's the Soviet Union, a superpower, frozen in its own ideology. It saw the cracks forming, it felt the tremors, but the attempts to change, like perestroika and glasnost, came too little, too late. The system was too brittle to bend, and so it broke, seemingly overnight. The pattern is crystal clear. Empires don't end simply when their power wanes. They end when their power becomes a prison, when they refuse to evolve. They end when the world changes around them, and they insist on standing still, clinging to the glories of yesterday. So, what really happens after this so-called final stage? It's not always chaos. It's not a guaranteed Mad Max-style apocalypse. It is transformation. The only question is whether that transformation is one you've prepared for, or one that is forced upon you, tearing down the old structures because you refuse to dismantle them yourself. History doesn't ask if change will come. Change is the only constant. It's coming for every system, every nation, every one of us. History only asks one question. Will you adapt before the system forces you to? In our next video, we're going to dive into something even more fascinating: how entirely new empires rise from the ruins of the old. and we'll explore the surprising reason why their beginnings never, ever look like power at first. You won't want to miss it. Make sure you're subscribed so you get notified. Thanks for watching.